Welcome back to the Nutrimedical Report and its live open lines, and we welcome you to call in. Remember, it's your program, and we've managed to, with Genesis Network, I've been now 10 years with Genesis, and it's an amazing expansion of our ability to reach out to people, and we always try to see if we can improve it. My rough areas are sometimes I get into rant mode or I interrupt my guests, but I'm trying to improve on that, except when I have to have a rant. We want to have more interaction with our public out there. The way we do it, though, we do screen all calls. We want it to be topically related to what we're talking about. We have some hours, like this first hour is going to be open lines on anything, from wellness to geopolitics to spirituality to anything you want to talk about, but it is all screened. A couple of rules. We don't do ad hominem attacks against, thinking that this is the attack channel. What we want to do is deal with issues like Ebola, the world economy, comments that are going on, and we want to talk about real functional medicine as it's advancing. And I recently read an article, as I mentioned a few days ago, by Ray Kurzweil, and I disagree with him on his transhumanism. We can understand from his background, though, part of the reason why a lot of Jews have become secular agnostic or turned into what I call scientists, where they basically figure the worshiping science and merging with technology will eventually create a Superman, the Übermensch, if you want to call it, in Germany. And the fact is that we need to have spirituality that supersedes our science, but we can do genetic research to eliminate illnesses. For example, they discovered a way of neutralizing the gene in Down syndrome in mice so that those children don't have to have the gene dosage effect that accelerates aging at double the normal speed. In fact, the best model for aging is not progeria, which is the Birdman syndrome, but Down syndrome. If you actually have a child that dies prematurely in their 30s, if you look at the neurofibrillar tangles, S100 proteins, plaque in their arteries, it's double the rate of a normal person. They're more like a person in their 60s or 70s. And that's why my daughter's on special nutraceuticals that are protecting her. We'll be doing retesting to make sure that her oxidative markers are fantastic. And the same goes with normal people. You don't have to read from the parts of your books that may predispose you toward different illnesses. For example, a new breast cancer gene has been discovered that raises the risk dramatically for breast cancer, and they call the gene the PALB2 mutation. I'm very concerned about people doing bilateral mastectomies in advance of the BRCA2 gene panel, which is also, as I say, it's epigenetically permissive. In other words, if you eat a diet with any deep-fried food, which is promoting inflammation, deficient in minerals like selenium and magnesium, if you have a predisposition to eating food that contains toxins, genetically modified food, etc., you're going to unveil those genes. Just like autism, when I went to medical school back in 1973, 41 years ago, the rate was one person in about 3,800 to 4,000. And it was we would have rounds, actually, to discuss it. It was so unusual. Nowadays, it's so frequent, and it's not just because of a genetic predisposition, because there is. The GSTM1, glutathione methyltransferase 1, catechol methyltransferase, and a few other genes that I personally have found, which I'll publish, clustered. And, of course, we need more data, like companies like 23andMe and a company out of Australia and Europe that can do gene clustering. The best is 23andMe that got shackled last December by the Fatal Drugs Allowed interfering federal agency. Hopefully, if they don't stop it soon, I and other doctors are going to sue their tail off. And I'm going to be contacting Jonathan Emore to discuss the FDA shackling of 23andMe, because if people can find their personal genetics, they can work around their doctor. And if the doctors are wise, they'll actually get on the train which measures functional medicine, which means you integrate it with whether you're a cardiologist or a surgeon and you want a better outcome and you want to prevent disease. And it also then ties directly to things like genetic engineering, where they discovered that they have a gene where they call it a vaccine, but it really isn't. It's a gene transvected that actually changes a liver protein, and it cuts the risk of heart disease by 90%. So if you have elevated levels of VLDL3 and there's specific genes you can look for, you can eliminate 90% of the risk of heart disease. I mean, who's not going to line up for that? Now, of course, you need nutraceuticals, because if you don't have the building blocks for a healthy body, you can't build one. But our current North American diet, where we have cattle that's raised with pro-inflammatory feed, that's not only genetically modified with soy, which is an omega-6 fat, canola oil, which used to be called rapeseed because it had racinic acid that's extremely inflammatory, safflower, sunflower, peanut oil, etc., all pro-inflammatory, and then we combine that with the lack of conjugated linoleic acid that's an essential amino acid, fatty acid. it's not surprising we have heart disease. In fact, they did research at McGill University in the 1920s, and they actually, you know how drug companies and food companies fund the research, and they did a pig study at the McGill University back in the 1920s. And what they discovered is that when you gave pigs margarine, because this is when they tried to launch margarine, they found it caused massive vascular disease. And what it was is they were doing research on cholesterol. And, of course, the research coming out of in Russia, they used oxidized cholesterol, and they found it caused heart disease. So everybody jumped on the bandwagon, cholesterol's bad. Well, I did research with Dr. Moskovitz as a resident in internal medicine at the University of British Columbia in 1977. That's a long time ago. And Dr. Moskovitz was a cardiologist and biochemist, and we were doing lipid analysis. And I would actually draw the bloods myself and have the buffy coat on the top. And we had Eskimos and people, there were native people from the Northwest Territories, Alaska, and the inside the Arctic Circle that never, ever ate white man's food. And they had cholesterols of 2,800 to over 3,000, and they never had a blocked artery. They were, stout and body built, but they weren't fat. In other words, they had round bodies to preserve heat and shorter limbs. And they were muscular. They didn't have a big bulbous stomach in terms of, fat layer. They did have adequate amounts of fat on them, but they had their blood basically was like, if you want to call it like motor, poured very smoothly and had low viscosity. They had no oxidized fat. What they discovered is whether you eat fat from animals that are fed bad things that are oxidized fatty acids and oxidized cholesterol, that's what gets under your artery walls. And these darn cardiologists know this. So when they give an HMG CoA reductase inhibitor, they backed off from the idea that they're trying to lower cholesterol, because head-to-head studies shows the omega cod liver liquid will lower your cholesterol more to what it needs to be. But 2/3 of the dry weight of your brain is cholesterol. All the hormones in your body, sex hormones, stress hormones, adrenal hormones, all the major hormones, cellular, a lot of the cellular interactive hormones are cholesterol-derived. Your CoQ10 is derived from cholesterol. If you don't have adequate cholesterol, your CoQ10 levels dive and you can't form mitochondrial function to create energy in your cells, ATP and NADH. So the doctors that have ignored these things, we need to fire them. We need to pull them along and step by step train them to learn functional medicine, because they don't know functional biochemistry, toxicology, everything from heavy metals in the environment to genetically modified food. And it doesn't matter if you're a surgeon trying to make sure that you do a breast implant and the person doesn't get an infection, or you treat someone who says that they have Alzheimer's when you can't do a brain biopsy. They don't do even a functional test to actually identify what is the physiology. Is it a circulatory problem? Is it a free radical or inflammatory problem in the brain? Is it a neurotransmitter problem? Is it patchy dysmyelination in different nerve tracts? Is there a problem with pacing nuclei in the base of the brain that are being calcified? Or is there a heavy metal problem? And I literally systematically will consult and help any specialist, any doctor, anywhere in the world, free, to teach them how to do medicine the way I do it, which is systematic functional biochemistry. And I've been doing it for more than a third of a century, probably longer than almost anybody else on the planet. So when people want to challenge, they said, who trained you? I said, I trained myself being curious. Yes, I attended seminars and so on, but by and large, I trained myself. And I was using research labs at universities years before there were functional labs available for other doctors. There were naturopaths, chiropractors, MDs, and holistic docs. And just by being curious, you ask questions, you realize how darn ignorant we all are, including every morning I get up and realize, oh my gosh, I feel like I know almost nothing. And again, one of the big questions we have that keeps coming up is Ebola. And I just want to pull up a lot of the Ebola literature here because I got a bunch of emails this morning. My dear wife, Michelle, she reviews a lot of my emails that go through Dr. Bill. And she sent me a pile this morning. And I want to go through some of these because Liberia declares a state of emergency as death toll rockets. And we're not talking about meaning rocketing. It goes exponential is what's going on now. And you need to understand that what that means is the cases in the last 48 hours went to 48 deaths and 108 new cases. Wow. It's exploding exponentially. Welcome back, and your questions on this or any other topic, especially we want to start off with Ebola because we have a lot of questions. I've been prepared for pandemic infections for years, starting in 1997, especially. I was actually reading an article from one of my medical journals, and on the front of it was an article by Dr. Osterholm, who was also at the University of Wisconsin and considered the top flu expert in the world. And he wrote an article. He also is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I received and tracked down the Foreign Affairs article as well, which he wrote. It just turns out that that was back in 1997 when I received documents from the World Health Organization headquarters in Basel, Switzerland, smuggled out by doctors from the HLI, Human Life International, given to me personally at their board meeting on March 16th, 97. Now, in 2004, when I read Dr. Osterholm's article, I realized that the H5N1 flu is going to become a real problem. And so I started researching into it and found out, of course, looking back at the documents I got back in 97, that in fact they were trying to resurrect the swine flu, and we're also talking about an avian flu in the future. By 2005-06, all 183 countries had signed treaties handing over their military to the United Nations and their healthcare systems entirely over to the World Health Organization. So all they need to do really is throw the switch to have literally a form of medical world martial law, which won't be a complete martial law. It'll be a medical martial law, lack of travel, control, etc., but can be the start of a wave of different tests, is to have any kind of pandemic. Now, Ebola has different characteristics, and I don't like to quote Huffington Post, but they mention usually a couple things that are right and a couple things that are off the mark because they're trying to control the media. And this is the most destructive myths about Ebola debunked. And of course, the fact is they talk about the virus is airborne, waterborne, spreads through casual contact. Of course, I don't know why they'd say that. To be quite honest with you, Ebola is probably about 300 times less likely to be spread than, say, the flu, where there were actually droppings at a zoo with a flu in the birds in Malaysia, and it actually infected people there with a more vicious form of H5N1 back around 5 years ago. And that was proven. It was just airborne droppings. Now, you're not going to have someone unless you have bodily fluid contact. So if you're taking care of someone dying of Ebola, whether it's their sweat, their urine, or their blood, or if they're beside you in an aircraft and they start coughing up blood or having bloody diarrhea and don't clean their hands properly and contact you or food you're eating, you're at risk. But the chances of getting infected in an airport or place unless you have close physical contact is pretty remote. But there still is a risk there. The risk is probably is quite a bit higher than zero, especially if you get a rapidly expanding virus that can spread for 2 to 3 weeks before the person gets violently ill. So it's not a zero risk, and in fact, what I see happening is a number of things that should be done, and this is a list that I'm going to keep repeating and expanding. The first thing is that anyone flying from a country of origin or traveling by boat or any other means into a Western country that within the last 6 months has been to any of these countries that has an origin of Ebola should be quarantined for 1 month. Anybody. And that doesn't mean if a lot of them will, for example, don't fly directly from Sierra Leone directly to America or Britain. They go through other alternative airlines. But if they show up in the country, whether they're flying or showing in any other way, because if you have a virus that can incubate for 3 weeks and spread a sufficient amount of virus that they can infect toilets, they can infect airline seats, they can infect almost anything, food service workers, before they get violently sick themselves, that's really serious. Now, one of the myths is, of course, some idiot Republican, of course they like to say that because you can see Huffington Post is pro-Democrat. They talk about Todd Rokita said that the ridiculous rumor bogus on Monday about the release of unaccompanied immigrant children could put at risk things like Ebola. No, but it does have swine flu, and it does have resistant TB, and it does have other viruses like the viruses, like other spirochetes, like the spirochetes that cause heart failure in Central and South America. And, of course, people don't realize that we also think that, for example, many of the diseases like Lyme and Lyme-like parasites, that humans can, quote, cross-infect the local infectious and other vector populations like white-footed mouse. So it's not just a one-way deal where we get infected from insects, we can infect them too. So it's not ridiculous. We don't do proper quarantine of these children. We're sending them out through airlines and so on. We don't have a proper immigration system. It took my son, who's born in Canada, he's 23, lived most of his life, except for a couple of years, in Canada. And I'm an American. And it's ridiculous, the amount of time and money, and he just got his citizenship a few weeks ago. That's my youngest son. My oldest son was also born in Canada. He got his citizenship quickly at 16. It was much more efficient back then. My second son was born in Augusta, Georgia, so he was an American right off the bat when I worked in Augusta, Georgia back in the late 80s. What people should understand is that we got a broken system and pouring a whole lot more money into a broken system with a giant bureaucracy and extremely high fees that make it impossible for a normal person to gain citizenship and to bring in intellectually people from countries like Malaysia, China, elsewhere that are going to have intellectual skill sets that we need, or just hard workers. I mean, the people from Mexico, if it wasn't for here in California, the hardworking Hispanic population, California would just stop. Okay, so let's get reality here. So what we need to do is we need to have an immigration policy that works, that screen out people who are criminals, who are felons in their own country, go through their consular offices, and to make certain that people don't carry infectious disease into the country, because we now have chikungunya, which is this weird-sounding disease that's now spread all the way to New York. We've got Chagas spirocitosis that now is infecting and dangerous for the blood supply, so the blood supply is not safe for hepatitis C, chikungunya, or these other infectious organisms, including chronic viral infections. If you actually screen the entire population for viral antibodies against things like cytomegalovirus and other viruses, you find an incredibly high percentage, between 75 and 85% carry the viruses. So Ebola is bad, but the public health policies are purposely being ignored. They don't have aircraft, for example, where they have a HEPA filter they did to the early 80s on every aircraft, and then they should be going in a chain of custody biohazard bag to a CDC-certified lab to look for resistant TB and other organisms. They should be drawing sera on anybody arriving from one of these countries by any means, boat, plane, whatever, if they've been there in the last 6 months, and it should be lengthened depending on how long this explosion of Ebola happens. They should be tracking them literally, if they're not put in quarantine right away, they should be literally tracked with phone calls, with visits with healthcare professionals, etc., or nurses that can actually go out there and evaluate them. One of the best ways to evaluate somebody, and I mentioned this before, is scalar technology. And I'm talking to a company and the engineers in China that developed a QRMA machine to start looking for what I call a scalar pathogen signals. In other words, you can actually scan someone for the specific biohazard signals of a pathogen in their body, if it's a biohazard, and know right away that they're at much higher risk of carrying that pathogen, and therefore you can take interventions there. So that needs to be done. That research, by the way, came out of Russia since the 1970s. China's been doing tons of work on it, and of course our DARPA. But you're not going to hear about this in the regular media. When we come back, we'll take your questions, and I'm going to expand on some of the other issues in the news that are going on. But Ebola's the big one. We have, of course, the first line of defense kit, Nutrimedical, Allicin Med, Alamax, Alamed, defense wipes and masks. It's much. Well, that's Tears for Fears, and of course that's pretty apropos. What's going on right now too is we were trying to update a lot of the news, and we're going to have a major update today in hour number 3 with Tim Alexander and with Chris Harris. I spoke to Chris this morning, our nuclear expert. That's his radio name. And we have some major updates on what's happened with reactor number 3, the MOX reactor, which they now admit had total loss of containment. That's the MOX, or mixed oxygen fuel reactor, which indicates that they were making advanced plutonium detonators for nuclear weapons there. So they had a hidden and occult program, which, by the way, violated previous treaties. The Japanese also were in some kind of a conflict with the State of Israel over materials that they were supplying, apparently, to nations like Iran. And so we don't have the full details on that, but we do know that what Japan is doing is they have a massive stockpile of nuclear materials. The Okimaru, which brought the waste nuclear materials 20-some years ago from the former Soviet Union to Japan, they have a giant stockpile ready to make a lot of nuclear weapons very quickly. And some of their rockets, the ones that launch satellites, and their satellite-based imaging system is among the best on the planet. It's probably right up there with our system, or the system that was developed for Europe, which, by the way, is now fully integrated with the American imaging system. So people may or may not know that. So we're going to do a major update there. I want to talk also about some of the other amazing news here. The most devastating things about Ebola, too, is that it's very likely, and it's not, by the way, hype. I think the danger areas around compressed areas, like, for example, shopping centers, airports where there is close physical contact, points of contact where people are in highly compressed areas like stadiums, where there is a significant risk that people can get infected, especially if somebody gets violently ill all of a sudden at the tail end of their illness, which can happen in a matter of minutes. If you actually look back to pandemic disease-type disorders, for example, like the 1918 flu, there are people that had, reports back then that would get on the train from Long Island, and by the time they arrived in New York City, they went from being healthy, alive, no fever, to full cardiac arrest and diathesis, literally bleeding from every orifice and vomiting out blood, and acute cardiac arrest. Ebola is, if anything, even more aggressive than that. So when it gets in its final death phases, it blocks and shuts down your immune system. It blocks your normal clotting system, so you can't stop bleeding problems. You get what's called a DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulopathy. And it kills you quicker than almost any disease on earth. I mean, it's one of the most amazingly rapid deaths. So what people should be realizing is that the biggest problem in Africa is, number one, superstition. Number two, these people live close together. They lack gowns, gloves, masks, and proper hygiene standards, etc. They don't even know how to properly prepare the dead, so they're not even properly knowing how to handle the dead so they don't free infect other people. So it's not just a problem, by the way, in Africa. It's going to hit here as well, but it won't be as bad. But it's primarily a test. Because if it's 300 times, let's say, theoretically it's 300 times, maybe it's 200 times, but it's hundreds of times less likely to be spread than the flu. But it has a case fatality rate of 90% in Africa, probably close to that here. And if you do manage to survive it, you're going to have significant end-organ damage, just like if you had bad flu, like the H1N1 flu. The cytokine storm can destroy your kidneys, can destroy your cardiovascular system, and can have significant damage to your brain. In fact, we know a number of people after the 1918 flu got what's called frozen man syndrome, almost like a post-polio syndrome to the basal nuclei and the corticospinal motor tracts. And they ended up with serious neurological problems, sometimes decades later. So, if you survive it doesn't mean you're going to be like 100%. You're probably going to be significantly less than 100% if you manage to survive it. A lot of people also will become ventilator dependent if they get enough lung damage. Now, the Ebola therapy is gone from a obscure biotech company. And Kent Brantley and Nancy Wrightball, the two Americans infected with Ebola in West Africa, appear to be responding to an experimental medicine devised by an obscure biotech company ties to the Defense Department. Doesn't that sound suspicious? And this is not the delusions of Dr. Deagle. This is, I'm reading it right off the news here, okay? So that's New York Times, by Andrew Pollack. So you can read the article yourself, published yesterday. And how and why Dr. Brantley and Miss Whiteball received the drug ZMapp, that's Z-M-A-P-P, that's capital Z, capital M-A-P-P. It's one of the many mysteries surrounding it. It was called a secret serum, including the big one. Does it really work? And, of course, the secret serum, it's a San Diego-based MAP Biopharmaceuticals. The primary developer of the drug was assumed Wednesday with how to manufacture more of it with an eye to providing the drug to more patients, probably in the form of clinical trials. Yeah. The absolutely overwhelming Larry Zeitlin, the president of MAP, said in an interview Wednesday, we are discussing with the FDA the right path to make the drug available to people as quickly and safely as possible. So a Reynolds American company in Owensboro, Kentucky is making ZMapp using the leaves of tobacco plants, but the product is very limited. So what they do is they actually transvect the tobacco plants, so they're actually creating a serum which is then given as a pharmaceutical to block the ability of the virus to spread. Well, look, we already have antipathogenics. We've got Nutrimedical, we have Silver 100, we have Allicin Med. I think it's very meddlesome for us to start sticking things in when we don't even know what's going to do to people. Yeah, it's very dangerous, but the problem is that the approach that I see them doing is they have no idea what this will do to people. And large scale, it may bring other genes from the tobacco plant in and get integrated into the person's genome, because a lot of these, remember now, they're unstable plasmids. And unstable plasmid means it's a envelope of nucleoplasm with specific genes that aren't integrated into the chromosomes, so they don't have the normal control mechanisms. And who knows what they're going to do. So, I think people should start realizing that this kind of genetic engineering, it needs to be a lot more careful. And why were they doing it in the first place? It turns out that the U.S. Defense Department also has the patents for Ebola, which sounds awfully dang suspicious. And when you start putting one on one, it still makes a very convincing two. And Nigeria, of course, is spreading. The fourth largest city on earth is Lagos, Nigeria. I think its general population, is estimated around 21 million, and that there's probably surrounding communities. That's a pretty big city. That's the fourth largest city on the planet. And I think it's the largest city in Africa, Lagos, Nigeria, which of course has a giant oil industry as well. A lot of people travel from there to Europe because they have quite a bit of money. Some of the upper class, they travel also, their oil engineers, to America and elsewhere. And they're going to travel by alternative routes because they don't want to be stopped flying directly from an African or originating country. So they'll go to Germany or elsewhere, fly to some other country first before they arrive in the United States or Canada or a Western country. So apparently there's also a new case in Europe. There's 3 now in America. The researchers trying to find potential treatments for Ebola. This is another research study. The Auburn University developed an on switch because the body's immune systems are turned off by Ebola. And they identified by lab identification number WY3161 as a relatively small molecule. It appears to reverse the immune blocking effects of certain viruses, including Ebola. Well, I'd like to see what it's probably a biological natural molecule. And what drug companies typically do is they add a methyl group to the side of it or some imidazole group or some other side group. And then they convert it from a natural molecule because it has different pharmacodynamics. It maybe takes longer to destroy it by the body because it can't detoxify it, which may or may not be really good. And then they do testing. And, of course, one of the problems with testing, and I've mentioned this before, is double-blind placebo-controlled trial is a bit darn insane and most of the time pretty unethical. The reason why I say that is because you have a polymorphic population that has different genetics, different toxic background, different environmental exposures, and different levels of fitness and nutritional life. And it's not like Wistar rats that all have identical genetics and nutrition. When you expose a polymorphic population to a different stimulus or different testing protocol, how can you make a conclusion with a Z-score and say, therefore, a chance of 1 in 20 that this is significant at 0.05%? So, as they say, lies, damn lies, and statistics. Come back to the Nutrimedical report, and I like that last advertisement on GCN, but I want to take it one step further. We are the media. We're not the medium trying to manipulate your brain like the Garbage News Network or the Cartoon News Network or the Fox or False News Network. We're trying to give you facts that are unspun, honestly, not overhyped. For example, Ebola is not being dealt with properly. It could be very easily contained. We're not sending adequate help from the CDC and the World Health Organization to stop a plague in these countries like Lagos, Nigeria, where they've had 8 cases and 2 deaths already, where it is going exponential. And if you have a large enough nidus or many thousands of cases are going exponential in these countries right across the sub-Saharan Africa, the chances of multiple cases arriving at airports and highly congested areas transmitting disease to the Western world is a guarantee. And when it happens, they're going to shut down the airports. You're going to see what I call an overreaction. You'll see a form of World Health Organization, United Nations martial law, which is what they want. And you'll see a lot of things slid under the carpet during that time of medical martial law that deal with financial aspects, derivatives markets, dollar, international finance, and other things that they want to slide under the carpet while the disasters are going on and people are being distracted by the exaggerated horror, which they could have stopped very easily. For example, if you have someone in Africa and you want to ship over a flat of Nutrimedical or a Silver 100 or defense wipes and other things and masks, in NIOSH masks, call us. We'll try to make arrangements to get a special price. The thing is that these are not experimental. They'll kill all known pathogens. If they have proper gloves, masks, and reverse protection, we could stop this in a minute. Same way as even proper training and burial of these people that are infected or sick. and education of the people in these little villages. Have someone come in there to educate them to say, don't run. Let's treat you so it doesn't spread to all your relatives eating the same food. Or if you're infecting your friends and relatives with sweat, coughing blood, or having bloody diarrhea at the same outhouse or same place, you're going to spread the virus. And so that's really, really important, and we're not doing that. And, of course, I think it's all on purpose. So I'm going to put a number of articles up so that people will see. I'm putting together actually a summary article to explain so people don't go over the edge getting panicky over it, but also have common sense. Everything I've seen the U.S. government do, the European government, and the Canadian government's doing more. They're almost embarrassingly doing more than America, but not enough. Anybody coming from origin of any of these countries, flying or whatever, that have been in Africa and these originating countries within 6 months needs to be quarantined for a month. They need to have sera drawn. They need to have other testing done to see if their immune system functions fine. And they also need to make sure that these people are tracked closely if they aren't quarantined, so that they can be tracked for physical symptoms. If they have fever, chills, bloody diarrhea, they immediately need to have viral tests on swabs and viral analyses. And as I say, experimental research needs to be done to prevent future pandemics using things like scalar technology, which I'm talking to the engineers in China about to develop the QRMA. So you can pick up the scalar signals long before you actually can see enough viral load. You can get a positive swab test or a stool test for virus or other tests, which take some time to incubate and have a lot of false negative test results. So we need to be much more proactive in that, and we're not. They put the highest level out for CDC for Ebola. And, of course, this is occurring at the same time that Israel is crushing the Gazans to death. They really want to either eliminate the population or force them to Egypt and Jordan, which, to be honest with you, the surrounding countries have a lot to do with this as well. Because a lot of the people that are in the Gaza Strip basically were from Egypt, were from Jordan, were from Samaria, or they're mobile. They had olive groves in Palestine for thousands of years. But they're mobile people, and they would take their herds and go to different parts so that they would graze in different parts, not destroy the land completely because you got desert land, you've got to move around. And most people don't know the history that, in fact, it was Islam that forced Hebrew people to become Islamic, because if they didn't, they were put to the sword. So from the time of Muhammad and the jihads, they created the problem, and now, of course, we have the return of people to Israel that are really, to a great extent, not genetically Jews. They're basically Khazarians. I don't really care, to be honest with you, if they were actually adhering to the original tenets of the Torah and not the Zohar and the Talmud of Babylon and other garbage. The fact is that we have literally, when they say their comments against the state of Israel are considered anti-Semitic, how about the people they're killing are the Semites? The Palestinians, 86% of them have actually ancient Hebrew genes. Less than 2% of the people that are the white Israelis, and now we're talking about not the Falasha Jews from Ethiopia or the black Jews from South Africa that have higher percentages of actual ancient Hebrew genes, they're treated as underclasses in Israel. It's really pretty weird. And UN reports dire impact on children in the Gaza Strip. Conflict has killed 408 children and injured 2,502. The Pernille Ironside, head of the UNICEF office in Gaza, said briefing documents in Geneva. So that's pretty weird. And, of course, the Russian troops increasing the Ukraine border raises concerns. Russia is going to move in because the heavy artillery is moving in toward crushing Donetsk. They've also warned the West and NATO, if you move across and put NATO troops into the area of Ukraine, you have started World War III. This is not a joke. Russia has moved last Thursday to the dead hand automated launch on command sequence for their nuclear forces against European, American, British, Canadian, and other cities. And if they decide to start something, the Russians can finish it very quickly. Ron Paul, of course, even made a statement to leave Ukraine alone. He's a voice of common sense in the midst of this, which is, avoid foreign entanglements. The reason why we have them is to support the banker system which we have, which is unethical and illegal. And every time they print trillions of dollars, they dilute the value of your dollar. So if you see your mortgage rates dropping, it's not because the government's nice or the banks are nice. It's because the value of your home has dropped. The reason why they're offering you a lower mortgage rate is because they've pulled a ton of equity out of your home, out of your bank account, and even out of the value of your jewelry in your safety deposit box. And it doesn't just affect Americans here. It affects everyone using the American dollar, like in Belize or anywhere else. Even if they're doing prostitution, it's an indirect tax. And of course, Russia's holding this war games. I don't think Russia's going to be able to hold off much longer. I think within, if there's any moves whatsoever by the current version of the junta, now that Yatsenyuk's government has fallen, the Ukrainian fighter, I think that you're almost certainly going to see an explosion of Russian coming across the border, and if NATO dares to stop them, it's going to be absolute horror. And the same thing goes with Syria. Syria is winning the wars. We have a new president of Syria, third term, Mr. Bashar al-Assad, and he's an eye doctor. He's not a stupid idiot. The people that are highly trained there, the three-man sniper teams in Syria, are the best in the world. They have advanced weapon systems from Russia that can completely stop anything coming across except a bird, maybe, into the airspace. Half of the country is mountainous, which makes it virtually impossible to do a ground-based attack. And so any attack on Syria, even by a large country like Turkey, which is now turning on Israel, making horrible statements against the actions of the Israelis, and Tayyip Erdogan basically has to do that because, remember, he's playing politics with the multiple groups inside Turkey that don't like what's going on, and which is why the Turks have not used their own army. They've used a proxy army to actually prosecute whatever conflict they're having on the Syrian border. So this isn't going well, and the Turks are going to turn, and I think you'll eventually see them turn on them. The situation, of course, is combined with what's going on, and I have the articles of impeachment for Barack Hussein Obama. Actually, I'll post up a link for that from the North American Center.com from the Center for Law and Justice. Those articles I actually have ready now with the hyperlink, so you can have a look at those. Recently, of course, the talk about the Iron Dome, which, of course, the Israelis now tried to get more funding for, and the Senate decided, no, you're not going to get more funding for it. That system all along has been funded by DARPA, by the way. These people, and they were developing theater air defense. They jumped over the Patriot system, which is why it took them from August of 1990 to February of 1991 before they decided to attack Saddam Hussein. And I know because of 1994, July 10th, I actually was security cleared at the Q level, which is the same level as the president, and took care of employees at U.S. Space Command, Strategic Defense, and Star Wars, and had a full media presentation of the theater air defense system. So I know firsthand, probably more than ever, anybody who's spoken about what we really have in space to stop nuclear weapons, and it's not open to somebody's opinion on it, it just is. And the fact is that our missile defense system, including theater air defense, is incredibly leaky. They rely on this system using plasma physics, which is also not by any means guaranteed it'll get all the missiles, but it's a black hole to dump in trillions of dollars of money for the missile defense system, and to pretend to the military and to the public that you're protected when you're not. That's crazy. And of course, Iron Dome is another example that the Israeli citizens have no protection whatsoever against incoming missiles, because when they get overwhelmed, it's over.